Hello and welcome to this LUMES Learning webinar on the topic of going global, the challenges of geographically dispersed teams and how to solve them. In the next half hour or so we'll be sharing some original research LUMES has commissioned and insights from successful programs and giving you 6 must-dos for building skills in geographically dispersed teams. Please use the online chat to ask questions as they occur to you. These will be fed in by the speakers at appropriate points and respond to question points as they come up and the speakers ask them. We also have a Twitter hashtag for this event, which you can see on the screen there, a hashtag GlobalLND on the bottom left there. Please use that to share your thoughts and insights with the Twitter sphere, and we can get a bit of a Twitter back channel going. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. We're very pleased to have Laura Overton of Towards Maturity leading the session today. She's a very well-known figure in the learning space. Towards Maturity does unique and invaluable work in benchmarking and sharing good practice in learning, and we think that so much that LUMES that we've become an ambassador very recently. Laura will be interviewing Carol Boer, who's Head of Learning at LUMES, who's a very experienced but useful designer of learning programs for global teams. So over to you, Laura.
John, thank you very much for that introduction, and welcome to everyone to this webinar. We're really hoping that we have some very practical insights, because when it comes down to it, with businesses and brands becoming more global, often our teams are dispersed around the world. But when our work environment is, volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, the challenges of really delivering consistent skills across those teams seem to be increasing by the minute. And I've certainly worked with global organizations for the last 25 years, but right now the challenges are massive. So in this session, what we want to do is to take a look at some evidence of success and actually try and work out from that evidence what are some of the practical things that we can do to increase our chances for success. And we've got 2 sources of information that we want to share with you today. One is from the Towards Maturity Global Benchmark, and we had over 130 organisations take part in our benchmark last year who were working from a global perspective. And the second is some early findings from LUMES's research in a brand new study looking at where we need to go. So we want to draw on some of that for you today. But before we do, we're really keen to find out what kind of challenges you face in rolling out skills programs globally in your organisation. If you'd like to put a comment or an answer in the question or chat box and just hit send, and that will be sent through to us and we'll be able to share it through. Alternatively, why don't you drop a couple of comments into Twitter under our #GlobalLND hashtag on Twitter, because it's really important for us in this session to focus in on the things that are actually you are facing right now in your own organisation. So if you want to share that with us, I'll just give you a moment or two just to type in, so that would be great. Fantastic. So I know that we've got a really broad range of organisations on the webinar today, working across different continents and looking at challenges that are being rolled out in your organisation. Okay, that's great. So thank you for that feedback, and we've got some really interesting ideas and thoughts coming through, and it actually matches in with some of the global organizations that we've been working with as well, because we asked them exactly the same question, and from this group we're seeing challenges like language, the ability to be able to be agile, to move quickly, the ability of balancing those local and global needs and working at a global level. And these are the sorts of things that we're finding through in our studies. So, keep reflecting through on those challenges, keep sending them in, because we want to be able to address them as we go through. Certainly in our research, we found that one of the top challenges that we found with the global organizations taking part in rolling out programs globally are issues to do with culture, with almost 3 in 5 of us saying, linking into yourselves, saying things like, how do we get that central kind of consistency, but being able to adapt to local differences. And also, how do we get that local stakeholder buy-in? You know, the people on the ground, how do we get them connected? So that seems to be one of the biggest challenges in our study, and certainly reflected in these comments. The second challenge that we found in our study, and again I think is reflected in some of the comments that are coming through here, are the whole issue around content. Either 2 in 5 of us are saying, you know, the stuff we're doing centrally isn't relevant locally, or conversely, the material that's developed locally, a third of us are saying, you know, that one of our challenges is that we're not getting that bubbling up and being shared centrally. So the whole issue of content certainly seems to be reflected in some of these challenges. Another challenge that we've seen, and certainly you're already mentioning, is this whole issue of different levels of technology. A number of you have said, you know, that different old versions of technology supporting internal processes, learning management systems, just that whole issue of inconsistent technology is a challenge that we found for about 50% of global organizations moving forward. And of course, last but not least, from our perspective, is the whole issue of language, and that cost of translation seems to be a real barrier to be able to get consistent learning rolled out. So we want to be addressing those challenges today in this webinar, and we're going to be looking at a number of areas. What are we trying to achieve globally? What is the role of technology in achieving our success? And then we want to dig in a little bit deeper into some of the top performing learning teams that took part in our study last year. Overall, there was around about 600 organizations, and some of them were really getting amazing results. So we're going to dig into some of the practical areas, and then I'm going to be interviewing Carol to find out how one of her organization clients actually took those tips and made it a reality. And then finally, we'll be coming back to some of those challenges that we've just looked at. So that's just a structure of the next 20-25 minutes or so. So in terms of what does global success look like, I think I've been really interested to see some of the early findings from the LMS study, where they were saying, you know, which global functions do you have the most challenge with in terms of rolling out consistent skills? And for me, I think what was fascinating with this was the second one down, was that 1 in 5 of the organizations taking part in the LMS study so far said, you know, the skills within HR and personnel, you know, how do we get consistency of approach around the globe, as well as perhaps the traditional skills of things like sales and customer service, IT, distribution, logistics, production and quality. So some very interesting aspects there. You know, how do we get those functions working globally? And in our own study, we also looked at what are the top skills that those global organizations are looking to roll out. And we found that, you know, the majority of global organizations are really focusing in on things like IT, leadership, induction, teamworking and communications as well, and also looking at some of those L&D skills that are needed around the globe in order to deliver that consistent area. And we found that over 90% of organizations in our study who are working around the globe are really looking at global programs for people like managers, admin staff and sales staff. And I think, interestingly for me, the LMS study showed that 70% of the people coming through so far are saying, you know, we need technology to help us to address those challenges. And when we look at the global organizations in our own study of those that are using technology, it's quite interesting to see some of the tools that are most common. Things like live online learning, the ability to produce custom content, the learning management system, the mobile technology platforms, and even internal enterprise systems like SharePoint are being used by over 80% of global organizations right now to really try and get that training out there. In fact, there are certain technologies that global organizations are using more than those that are operating locally. They're twice as likely to be using things like virtual classrooms, or to be tracking or recognizing learning through things like learning record stores and use of badges. They're 60% more likely to be using social media in their learning solutions, and also 30% more likely than non-global organizations to be using things like user-generated content, you know, our staff generating content for themselves and in-house video. And I think when we compare that to some of the predictions from the LMS area, you know, I think moving forward, they're finding that global companies are, you know, not just using mobile, but starting to say, okay, well, what about bring your own device? How do we blend some of these technologies together, and how do we facilitate the right content and collaboration? So, you know, the MES study really is one to watch and also to take part in if you get a chance. But I think one of the key things for us is, you know, why are we turning to technology? And we're finding in our own work that 95%, almost everyone who's working in a global field, are trying to address these aspects, every single one of these aspects, not just the compliance issues, but, you know, how do we use these technologies to adapt that content to individual, to local need? How do we reduce the time to competency? Picking up on the point in the discussion earlier about, you know, we need to become more agile. How do we get more employee engagement, more buy-in to the global brand at a local level? And also the issue of how do we improve quality in those far-flung places, and also improve the administration. But how well are we actually achieving if we know through our own study that technology is being used to try and address those issues? How successful have we been so far? Well, when it comes down to compliance, actually global companies have been pretty successful in driving out global consistent compliance training, which is pretty good. But when it comes down to some of these other things that we're looking for, there's a real struggle here in us really trying to improve the quality, the administration, and reducing that time to competency, which is so critical for that agility at the moment. So what we wanted to do with you today is to kind of share with you, okay, well, what could be some techniques that would help us to improve those results? So we wanted to look at the top performing learning organizations in our Towards Maturity benchmark, many of whom are global organizations, but all of whom are twice as likely, with the exception of compliance, to be achieving some of these results. So we want to dig in a little bit more about what are those organizations doing that can help us address some of the issues and really take advantage with technology. So some of those tips for top deck learning organizations, I'm going to run through them quite quickly because really what we want to do is put the flesh on the bones of this by bringing Carol into the conversation. So the first tip that we find that all these organizations do with the top deck organizations is that they start with the end in mind. So 90% of them are saying, you know what, let's look at this global skills issue before we go ahead and recommend a technology, a solution, a piece of content. But actually on average with global companies, only 3 in 5 of us do this. So, you know, having a real clear field of vision of where we want to go as a result of this program is absolutely critical. Common sense, but not currently common practice in global companies. The next is the global organizations, or the top learning organizations do, is they're very much more likely to kind of create a kind of a sense of a structure and a framework. And that's even more important for when you're working with a dispersed audience globally. And so, for example, the top deck are twice as likely to use structures or learning structures such as academies to kind of bring together a common framework, a common structure, a common communication across the globe for their program. So creating a framework is important. The third area, and it is certainly something that's coming through in the MES study, is how do we harness the power of the blend? How do we take all of those technologies, combining it with the face-to-face and the local context to really create something that's useful and powerful for the individual? And again, the majority, 85% of those top deck companies are taking these tools and working out how to blend them into the right solution alongside face-to-face learning to meet the requirements of the individuals. Yet the global companies, despite all the technology we're using, only 1 in 5 of us are really starting to look at that blend. Part of the blend is how we embed learning into the workflow. It just doesn't start or stop with the course. But the top deck organizations are very cognizant of, you know, how do we need to support the individuals wherever they're based in the organization around the globe. And yet only 50% are actually, of global companies are starting to think about that performance support aspect of the way that we encourage the building of consistent skills. And then the penultimate one is the ability to be able to encourage sharing, collaboration and communication within the community that we're involved with. And the top tech organisations are 3 times more likely to say that they know how their staff, and they help their staff to communicate, collaborate and share knowledge. So whilst as global organisations we might be slightly more likely to be using things like social media, really harnessing it and helping the organisation to be able to use it is so critical. And then the 6th area, which I think is absolutely essential when it comes down to particularly getting local stakeholder buy-in, is that those top learning organisations are consistently working out how they demonstrate the value of their solutions on not just a local to the centralised stakeholders, but on a local level as well. So 4 and 5 are going to be sharing those successes with managers both centrally and also locally, compared with just 3 in 10 of global organisations at the moment. So for me, there's some really powerful kind of concepts and evidence that shows that these kind of characteristics actually make a difference to the results. But the trick is, how do we put them into practice? And this is, Carol, if you don't mind, I'd really love to bring you into the conversation now and just to share with us, you know, some of the experiences that you've had in turning this into a reality.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Laura. So I will get back to those 6 tips in a minute, but first I'd just like to introduce the Vodafone Marketing Essentials case study and the problem that they were facing as an organisation. So they did a review, an organisational review, and it was clear that they needed to tackle and achieve a unified approach to global marketing. And that actually meant tackling 3 main areas. So that was, first of all, the amounts being spent on reinventing old campaign strategies. 40% of budget was being spent on this. Also the fact that there were no standards for global marketing. There were no standards at all across 20 organisations. 20 local markets all have their own ways of marketing, and that's over 4,000 marketeers. So you can imagine, clearly there was a need to get some standards in place. So, going back now to the tips, so Laura pointed out that there were, 6 things that organisations were doing in order to achieve global consistency without compromising on local integrity. And for me, I think the Vodafone case study does in fact give us some really clear examples of how this can be achieved. So if we start with the first one, starting with the end in mind. Did Vodafone start with the end in mind? Absolutely yes. The programme, as I mentioned, was driven after an organisational review to ensure that the business was equipped for the future, and the goals were aligned to those business goals. So the review highlighted the need for a global marketing function that drove value, won new customers, and they wanted to reduce churn. So those were the organisational goals. So with this in mind, Vodafone came up with a programme, and the goals around the programme were to inject customer into the marketing thinking, join up the dots in their approach to marketing, and help to break down those organisational silos. And what was interesting for us as one of the parties working on the project is that when we worked together, we didn't tackle this as a learning project at the outset. The parties involved were clear that we were actually creating a unified way of marketing. We were not there to just create a set of learning interventions. And then on to the next point, the framework. So a new framework was derived, and that was the Vodafone way of marketing. And what that meant for us, it meant coming up with standards, it meant coming up with procedures, creating a collaborative environment, which meant that we had a home for the marketing community and a set of universal tools that ensure consistency. So the Marketing Academy itself, and I mean, Laura mentioned earlier that that's something that top performing organisations are doing, was the access to all learning. So that wasn't just the e-learning, it was the face-to-face, the webinars and videos, and the comms and the promotions that held this community together. And then the power of the blend. It wasn't just a technology-driven solution. A blended solution was the best fit in this situation. So in order to achieve that sort of commonality and consistency, we had universal design principles across the whole of the blend. It was really important for us to reinforce that consistent theme. And remember, you know, that one of the issues was inconsistency in silo working, so it was absolutely key that it felt really joined up. And then after that, you know, we had an opportunity then to push that learning out through the academy. So as I mentioned before, the academy was the home. It provided access to the learning. So there were videos from leaders, and they were stakeholders, and they were championing this, and they provided those videos through the academy. There was access to tools and templates that were created to unify the approaches within the organisation. The e-learning was an e-magazine style of e-learning. Inside that e-magazine, there were editors providing their own insights. And then the workshops, you know, this is where marketeers could connect with one another, they could connect with their community, they could access real customers. And then following on from those workshops, there were specialist workshops, deep dive workshops, where they could then apply their knowledge further and then practice a real pitch to a Vodafone group of leaders. And then following on from that even, there were a set of deep dive webinars where they could share again with the community, so sharing and collaboration was key. And embedding learning in the workflow, so I mentioned the tools and templates that were created. These are all available from the academy. They were showcased within the e-learning. They were introduced in the e-learning, and that was key to consistency across the global teams, and the feedback on that was really good. The marketeers were also encouraged to identify, when they came out of the workshops, projects that they could apply fast fixes to. So areas that they've been working on, they could create action plans and then work out how they could sort of bring these to market, you know, improve the ways that they were working. This was after the learning. Now, sharing and collaborating, and I think that the deep dive workshops and certainly the workshops themselves were great for that. It gave marketeers a real opportunity to problem solve. They had real projects and they learned by doing. After those deep dive workshops, the series of webinars that actually happened about 4 weeks later gave them that opportunity to share their success stories, discuss challenges, help them to overcome problems, and all of that helps to ensure the learning is embedded. It irons out any issues that they're facing. And demonstrating value globally, so going back to the goals, the 3 goals were defined as a part of this future-proofing exercise, injecting the customer into marketing thinking, joining up the dots in the approach to marketing and helping breaking down those organisational silos. So what do the results look like? And it was key to prove those results. So the first result was that insight-driven propositions, they were being reported as an increase in the number of propositions with a clear insight. 85% reported an increase in competency across all functions, and 86% experienced an increase in collaboration between functions. And this was all derived from feedback after the workshops.
Carol, I think this is such an amazing story. Did Vodafone also then share some of these results back internally to kind of capture the attention and the buy-in of stakeholders globally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, communication was key on this. It wasn't just a sort of an initial communication. Communication was being driven through the Chief Commercial Officer and through senior leaders. Stakeholders were absolutely key in communicating that out to the local teams.
Okay, that's
in
great.
fact, I can talk more actually about some of the things that Vodafone did. Sorry, Laura.
No, I was going to say it would be interesting to know from the audience of what kind of strategies you might have tried to get global buy-in, because often we are doing things with technology and we are rolling those out, and so it would be really interesting to know what's worked and what hasn't within the audience, or also what challenges you might have faced in getting that buy-in, or questions that you might have for Carol as well. So, do take a moment before we kind of go into some specific examples, just to perhaps stop and reflect on how you get buy-in on a local level to some global programs. While you're writing that in, do put it into the question box or go via Twitter on #GlobalL&D. It's an opportunity to perhaps reflect on, just some of those areas. And I love the way, Carol, that that blend also allowed that kind of local connection with the content through things like webinars, and you're bringing people together to collaborate and share. And the brand overall of the academy, I think, was a really good technique there as well. Okay, so I'll just give you a minute just to kind of share some of your thoughts on that. I've come across a couple of examples where organizations were rolling out a centralized program, and one of the ways they got to get local buy-in was actually they got local people to help to shape that program. So they brought in with the program right up front. In fact, there's a case study on our site on some work that was done a while back in Toyota to really kind of get individuals based all across Europe to kind of help shape what the solution needed to be, and therefore they got their buy-in right up front. So that's one example that we've seen coming through. But Carol, I'm going to kind of hand back to you now, and we'll come back. There's some great questions that are starting to come in, and we'll actually come back and address those in a minute. But Carol, perhaps you want to share a little bit about how Vodafone have got that buy-in locally.
Yeah, of course. So I guess there's many things that they did, but I guess for me there are some key things that they did. And here's just 4 things that they did to get that buy-in. I think one of the first things that resonated with me is that we often spend a lot of time getting to understand and learn the needs. And in this example, a member of our SME team actually spent around 6 months working with the marketing team, really getting an insight into the way that they worked in the UK. And they ran lots of focus groups as well, overseas too. So that insight was really invaluable for us. Second, engaging local markets. So Vodafone, it was absolutely key that they connected with each of the markets to assess what their individual needs were. And the focus there was not just sort of about asking them what sort of content they needed or trying to do some sort of needs analysis. It was also sort of looking at their preferences for learning. One of the pieces of feedback that we got from Vodafone in Egypt said that they felt that the distance learning approach would not be enough for them. They really wanted to physically work out issues together, and that led to the need to create these workshops and opportunities for deep dive webinars and follow-up sessions, because connecting the community was key to the success of this blend. And I think promotion too. It wasn't mandatory. It was never meant to be a mandatory program. So promotion was key. It sort of happened top down, and it also happened bottom up. So, there were incentive programs that were organised to encourage people to do over, 5 of the 7 propositions. And every marketeer, for example, who completed those 5, got a chance to sort of win a tablet. And I think that, local, in terms of communication, I think I mentioned this before, that it was driven from right from the sort of chief commercial officer, and calls to action were going out to those senior leaders. And they were ongoing. It wasn't just an initial promotional push, they kept happening throughout. And then local launches. So what Vodafone did was create launch packs. They were full of Vodafone branded marketing merchandise, USB sticks, badges, and promotional posters and so on, so that the local launches could happen locally, and there were Q&As in their materials to help them ensure that those local launches were, successful and well supported. So I think for me, that's how they achieved the buy-in.
Yeah. I think for us, Carol, I think our data, our evidence from those top performing learning organisations really backs up what you've been doing with Vodafone. We found that they are 30 or 50% more likely in the top organisations compared with the global organisations to be using things like steering groups. You know, like you mentioned, Carol, about the academy having, you know, so that commercial, a C-level commercial executive really driving that through, and the steering groups. We also find that those top deck companies, compared with other global companies, are 3 times as likely to really get to grips with who their learners are and what their learners' needs are, particularly addressing some of those challenges there. They are twice as likely to be working with those local champions, you know, people on the ground who are helping people to apply and to promote the program, and 3 times as likely as well to be equipping local L&D teams to be able to deliver within this kind of new environment, which I think that really goes back to that LMS study earlier on. And they're also nearly 3 times as likely to have a communication plan in as well. So basically, Carol, the things that you've been talking about are absolutely reflected in the top performing learning organisations as well. So kind of to close off today, you know, what I'd like to do is perhaps revisit some of those challenges that we identified at the beginning of the session. You know, the issues of culture, the issues of getting content out that's relevant at a local level, the issues of technology platforms and language. You know, and if we're going to be scaling up, we have to manage risk in these areas. And Carol, you've given us some brilliant ideas from Vodafone on perhaps how we can do that. But before we close off, I know you've had so much experience with other global organisations. Are there some other things that you want to be sharing with us to help us really manage the risk in these areas?
Yeah. So yes, certainly we can identify with those themes, and I have some tips for avoiding the pitfalls. Some of them are sort of more strategic, some of them are design based. I think the first one for me is really ensuring that you really know your audience. So by ensuring that the content and treatment approach are appropriate and relevant for a global audience, you have to know that audience. You have to know their culture. So that example I gave earlier, where the SME spent sort of 6 months on the ground shadowing, the global teams and doing focus groups with the global teams, that gave us the insights we needed. And then I think the second point, the consistency theme. I think it's very easy to think that when you're creating a global program, that consistency means inflexibility, and I think that we learned very quickly that wasn't the case. That's absolutely key to make it relevant for the local markets. Our brief, I guess, was when we were working with Vodafone was to make it relevant for the local markets, but don't change the essence. So, for example, we would maybe swap out a video case study to put a relevant one in for that local market. Simple things like that, really made a difference. And then, selecting, somebody mentioned earlier in the chat, select the translation was a challenge. And I think it's key actually to select the right translation and localization resources. It's not about just clicking a button and swapping a language file. It's important to use localization experts who understand the context. And also, when your teams are working on global programs, you have to think about logistics. Like if the team who created the source version are having to edit a translated version, how are they going to get feedback to get those localizations into the program? And then I guess ensuring that subject matter experts, designers and developers consider global requirements at the outset. Everyone really needs to sort of be on the same page at the start. So that means things like you're writing in international English, considering how you approach the design, even things like space restrictions when you increase the size of the language will take up. So we used for example a technique where we would art direct in the English version, and we would increase the font size so that we knew that when we created the German version that we could fit that on screen. So we had techniques like that, and we were realistic about the fact that we did need to make it editable and translatable and localizable, and not using graphics to convey messages. Always avoiding text on graphics, and making sure that you run pilots in the source language and deal with global pilot group feedback. And I guess going back to the start, involving those global stakeholders at the outset. I think in summary then, it sort of aligns very much to your slide, Laura, and I think that learning solutions should certainly, for global programs, should certainly be designed with these 4 dimensions in mind. The audience culture, and you talked about content. I think I would focus on effective global design, making sure that it's appropriate to the audiences. A lot of treatments that you might use for one audience, maybe UK-centric audience, may not be appropriate cross-culturally. Bear in mind that you are going to be doing translation and localization. You need to apply rules to make sure that you avoid issues created by language-specific and culture-specific content. And then I think adaptability as well. This might come down to the technologies that you use to create or even deploy the learning, but ensuring that it can be adapted easily and in a cost-effective way.
Carol, that's brilliant. There's so many practical ideas in there, from the practicalities of designing in a bigger font so that you can accommodate later the language which use slightly more letters in. I think just some very, very practical thoughts there. I'm hoping that today's session has really given our audience a sense of something that they might be able to take away and try and do differently, because what we've been sharing today is the opportunity to kind of look at the evidence of practical things of what those top performing learning organizations are going to be doing, and we've been given some amazingly helpful hints and tips of how we can make that a reality for ourselves. But one of the things I kind of encourage you to do is to really start to think right now, just to take a moment again, if you want to put it into the chat box, it's confidential, but just to say, what's the one thing from this seminar that you actually will be able to do differently or would like to try out and do, because we've spent a half hour, 40 minutes together, and we want this time to be really worthwhile. And high-performing organisations, they take the data, they take the evidence, they take the insights, but then they turn that insight into action. And I think that's really what Vodafone has done. They've taken action on some of these areas and delivered some amazing results. So, do use Twitter, #GlobalLND. To say the one thing that you've learned from today, and also to catch up on the back chat as well, or just place a comment in there. But while you're doing that, while you're owning this webinar for yourselves, Carol, I'd just like to come back to you and say, what are the key insights and actions that you think we should be taking away as a result of today?
Yeah. So I'll pick up on the first 3, Laura. So I think for me the ones that are really powerful in the case study that I just went through is the first one, certainly starting with the end in mind. I think a key success criteria for Vodafone was having those organisational goals and aligning the programme goals to those organisational goals. And then the framework, clearly there was a marketing framework here that was being created, and the key to the success of that was the unification, everything being standardized, everything being accessed by the marketing academy. And then the power of the blend, the key to the success of this, was understanding what the audience challenges were, what their needs were, and designing around that. The e-learning was great, presenting the theory in the case studies, and the workshops and webinars were really great at bringing those communities together. And then there were the tools which ensured that learners or marketeers could actually then apply what they'd learned and continually use that on the job.
Yeah, Karen, I think all of those kind of really add up into helping people as well to be able to use this information, to actually be able to start to embed it into the workflow. I loved some of those kind of tools that you gave people to use in the training, and then they were available via the framework, via the academy, to be able to go out and use and do things differently. And I think for me also, the ability to allow individual, global, often isolated regions to be able to have a voice, to be able to share and collaborate on what they are doing with those resources and to communicate their successes back. I think that's actually really important, giving that voice rather than having some rigid thing inflicted on people from the centre. And then again, like you did in Vodafone, not to hide your successes under a bushel, because they may have amazing results in certain aspects around the globe in your organisation. Grab those successes, share them back with other areas that perhaps haven't been as engaged. So use the value that you're creating on a regional level to inspire other regions as well. So Carol, you've been great in actually sharing and bringing to life some of these top performing learning organisations kind of strategies and how they can work in a global organisation. And really, John, I'd like to kind of perhaps hand back to you to see how we can perhaps use the last remaining minutes to answer some questions. Hopefully we'll hand back to John.
Hello, sorry, sorry, I'm back in the room. Yeah, we've got several questions that have come through, Laura, thanks for that. How were central initiatives funded locally? Hello?
Carol, do you want to take that one first? How were central initiatives funded locally?
Okay, I have limited information on this, but I do know that initially it was funded centrally. I do believe, though, that because of the stakeholder involvement and involvement with the leadership teams, they had very high adoption rates of leaders who were taking on this program and getting involved with this, that the other funding sources came forward, I guess almost voluntarily. Something I guess is quite unusual, but it was definitely championed, and I guess they had to put a business case together for this, and getting this right was key in order to meet those organisational goals. It's clearly a very sort of a strategically aligned project, so the ROI was huge, and the cost of getting it wrong was huge too.
Yeah, and I would say that also in certainly in our work, we've done a number of case studies with global organisations under going global on the Towards Maturity site. But there's been a range of different ways that they've addressed this, and the successful ones who've been able to get local budget and local buy-in have actually, in fact, been following some of the steps that we've been talking about. So they've got the local teams involved up front in defining what's needed. So there's a kind of a sense of ownership up front and a sense of value of, what are they expecting to achieve from it. And when they actually believe that they've kind of informed it and that they can see the value because of that up front, then they are more likely to be putting their hands in their pocket and say, actually, yeah, I can see how me contributing to that program will be more cost effective and more valuable than me doing it alone. So are there some other questions there, John?
Lovely. Here's another question. Here's another question. We found it a challenge to overcome some local opposition to new programs that won't work for us in this office. We do things differently.
Definitely heard that one before. I just share with you before, because I know, Carol, you've shared a bit on this, but shared it with you an analogy that I have come across, and it picks up on something that Carol said about, deciding what the essence is and then allowing people to adapt it locally. I think a lot of the problem is that because a lot of us put investment into e-learning content and then just roll that out, that's where we have the challenge. Whereas if we start to look at this broader blend, we can really start to think of a much more flexible approach to actually rolling out those programs. And it's the analogy that I was given once was we need to have a kind of a fried egg approach to global programs. We need to define the yolk very clearly. What is the essence? What are we all trying to achieve? And then to define the areas where people can adapt that locally. So in each area, that fried egg would look different because there are aspects that they can own, that they can collaborate on locally. And I find that a particularly helpful program. I've dealt with global organizations for most of my career, and that the issue of being force-fed a particular diet without having any choice is the thing that puts most people off.
Okay, so we've got another one here. We'd like to start extending our current health overseas offices. A few essential changes as a result of these ideas.
Oh, John, couldn't really hear that hear that very well. Carol, can you repeat it?
Yes, can you hear me now? Is it helpful to have this framework called tips? No, we'd like to extend our current health overseas offices with a few essential changes as a result of these ideas.
So yeah, I think I picked that up. So it was some practical tips for extending the reach of the academies across, different territories. I guess one of the things I didn't touch on was the technology side, but I know that Laura did touch on it as a way that organisations were top performing organisations were sort of achieving this sort of global consistency. So getting the glue right really is academies I think are quite key for that. It doesn't have to be an academy, but having a central place to go where people can collaborate, communicate, access information, and something that lives and breathes and exists beyond the learning. So not just creating some sort of intervention, it's something that needs to carry forward a continuous improvement. And I think academies can do that. And I think the results for us, some of the feedback coming back from Vodafone showed that people were using these. This was across the globe. They suddenly found that the speed to market, for example, was a lot quicker because they had consistency. Sign-off processes were a lot more straightforward. And when individuals can see the benefits, then they're going to use it. So I think it's key to ensure that you keep promoting those benefits and getting people on board.
Yeah, it's all about communication. It's all about listening and communicating. Absolutely. I think that was all for the questions, and I just want to say a massive thank you to Carol for sharing some of those areas with us today. There is still an opportunity to get involved with the LMS study. I'd really encourage you to do it. There's a lot of questions in there that will help you kind of think through some of these areas today. Equally, the case study is available to download as well from this link, and this slide deck is up and available on SlideShare as well if you just go to tinyurl.com global L&D. And obviously Carol and myself would be very happy to answer any questions offline or on Twitter or LinkedIn or anything else for that matter. So just want to say thank you everybody for joining us today, and hopefully this session's been useful. If it has, share it with your teams, use some of the content to inspire discussion, and let us know how you get on. So thank you very much.